Welcome everybody to Mind Science TV. Here we are again. Every week I sit here and say I've got someone fascinating, and guess what? I've got someone fascinating. So that's what we try and do. We try and bring you these wonderful people. And so let me introduce you to the man who's looking around for the fascinating fella. And this is a really interesting bloke named Bruce Ecker. So Bruce, I just have to say welcome to Mind Science TV, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Yeah, so now what I'm going to do is I just spend a minute or two, I just give a few introductions about yourself. So if you just wait a couple of seconds more, I'll just give a quick chat, and then we'll get on with our discussion about memories, reconsolidation, coherence therapy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, all these fascinating things that Bruce Ecker has developed, been involved with, and is raising into our consciousness. He certainly is the developer, along with some wonderful people. He's got a great team around him and cooperate. Laurel Hulley is the co-founder and co-discoverer, creator and developer of Coherence Therapy. He's got some other wonderful people. If you go to his website, which is www.coherencetherapy. Yes, it's coherencetherapy.org. Go to that, but I'll have there's a link on the Mind Science TV page. And he's a psychotherapist in private practice. He's in the San Francisco area. I've got some good friends up in San Francisco. I'm looking forward to being up there at the end of the year for the Erickson conference, which will be fun. And what Bruce has done, he talked a lot about brief therapies and getting deeply into areas. He's got a wonderful book. What's the other one? The depth-oriented brief therapy, which is really interesting book talking about brief therapy. Doesn't have to be shallow, but it can be brief. He's also written, and I've actually got a mock-up here of the cover of Unlocking the Emotional Brain. Let's see if we get a bit closer so you can see some of those things. Eliminating symptoms and their roots using memory reconsolidation. Now, I'm imagining a lot of you are sitting there going, well, what does that mean? Well, that's what this talk is all about. Because memory reconsolidation is an understanding that we're just coming to grips with over the last 4 or 5 years. And what Bruce has done has brought it into the context of doing therapy. That's what we want to talk to him. Coherence therapy, reconsolidation. Let's get on to Bruce. Well, there we go. That's the chat about you, Bruce, and a plug for a book. Now, the book's not out yet. It's that's not out. When's it coming out?
September 2012, late September, we expect.
Fantastic. I think people will be watching this interview in August. So now, I've been into Amazon and I've seen it there, and it's up for pre-orders. So, you know, everybody go in there and get your pre-order, which is good because you save a few dollars, which probably sends Bruce broke, but not to worry. That's the way it goes. So that's September. Now, how long has this book been in the making?
Oh, about 4 years. This book was a journey for us. It's the vision of what this book would be kept evolving, and really led us into territory we didn't know we would wind up in. The book really does 4 different things that we feel are significant. It not only describes how the use of the reconsolidation process by therapists can create a sizable increase in the regularity of getting deep lasting therapeutic breakthroughs in day-to-day practice. So there's the effectiveness and satisfaction aspect of the book. But in addition, what evolved was that this reconsolidation in therapy framework, which does not belong to any one system of therapy. You know, it belongs to the brain and the mind. And so a framework of psychotherapy integration developed that we feel could have great utility across the field. There seems to be emerging, as we describe it, a unified view of psychotherapies of transformational change, deep, lasting, fundamental change. And we think this new framework can give therapists across different therapies a shared language, a shared understanding of deep change, so that they can speak to each other and understand each other's systems and the legitimacy of each other's systems for creating transformational change better than ever. We're very excited about that aspect. Then there is a unified view of the attachment debate, the ongoing attachment debate, sometimes called the great attachment debate.
Yes.
This process allows therapists to determine with a given client whether or not attachment-based learnings underlie a given presenting problem, non-theoretically, non-speculatively. And so therapists can choose and shape the therapy very sensitively, very attuned to the individual client and the individual problem of the individual client, according to whether attachment-based learnings are actually present. So there's a new, not just a unification of the attachment debate, but what we see as a kind of resolution of the attachment debate. Those who feel attachment is always involved, and those who feel no. There are other underlying causes of various symptoms and problems. Well, everyone is right some of the time, and now we have a practical methodology that puts that to use. You can see that it's so, and it guides therapy very sensitively. And then the fourth of the prongs that wound up developing in this book is this process of what we call the therapeutic reconsolidation process. The steps with which therapists can apply the reconsolidation mechanism of the brain turns out to pose a significant challenge to nonspecific common factors here. Now, not all therapists and counselors care about that or even might know what it is, so I won't go on about it. But it's a controversial, it's an important controversial theme in the psychotherapy field, whether or not psychotherapeutic effectiveness can ever come from specific technical procedures that utilize well understood mechanisms of change. The non-specific common factor theory says nope, almost negligible degree of that is real. And that empathy, the alliance, the repair of ruptures, etc., is what has most of the effect, 85% of the therapeutic effect. This reconsolidation research on firm empirical grounds really raises questions about that now. To us, that's terrifically interesting too. So all of those things are in the book.
That's fabulous. And those four sort of sections you were talking about there, collectively, that's what you call coherence therapy? Is that,
well, no.
Is that correct?
Yeah, now you're getting into something that's harder for me to describe off the cuff.
Even more detail.
But we've developed a new framework that isn't about any one therapy, including coherence therapy. We call it the emotional coherence framework. It's a unified body of knowledge, the latest, what I would attempt to call advanced knowledge now that we have about how emotional memory works and how emotional learning, deep implicit learning, and unlearning work. This reconsolidation is the brain's built-in mechanism for profound unlearning of existing emotional learnings. So,
yeah, sounds great.
You know, it's a non-theoretical framework that isn't tied to any one system of therapy. We use coherence therapy as a demonstration platform in the book to show in an instructional, clear manner how the therapeutic reconsolidation process can be used. But we also show the therapeutic reconsolidation process unfolding in 4 other therapies. AEDP, you know, Diana Foch's approach.
Yes.
Emotion-focused therapy, EFT, EMDR, and also IPNB, interpersonal neurobiology, Daniel Siegel's approach. And we show that even though those therapies don't describe their own steps, their own methodology in these terms, nevertheless, these core steps of process that make up the therapeutic reconsolidation process are definitely detectable in all of the therapies. And we demonstrate that in the book. Coherence therapy is perhaps distinctive only in the sense that its own self-definition matches the reconsolidation research, the steps of process identified by neuroscience researchers. Coherence therapy matches their results very explicitly step to step. And so that's why coherence therapy serves so nicely as a demonstration platform for instructional purposes.
Ah, no, well, that's good. So we won't pursue the coherence therapy because what I'm interested in too is this whole idea of, can we get away from, to some extent, as best we can, get away from specific therapeutic practice, of which, as we know now, research, there's hundreds and hundreds of them, everybody finding nuances of change, and actually moving down to, so are there fundamental elements that we can utilize in the application of any therapy? But this idea, we've just been coming to grips with brain plasticity, that the fact that the brain can do things and change and alter as we go through life. Certainly, I'm getting involved now in genetic plasticity and epigenetics and things of that nature. So we're seeing that actually, in principle, our biology is actually not fixed, and it's not designed to be fixed, as was our sort of our attitude towards things. Our intellectual attitude was the brain gets fixed and the cells get fixed and the organs get fixed. That's not true.
Right.
But what you're talking about is something more. It's more. Please, it's just...
Yeah, this reconsolidation is a new form of neuroplasticity, the existence of which was not suspected until it was discovered and confirmed beginning in 2000. In fact, up to that point, a century of research had built up the view, largely extinction research, had built up the view that emotional learnings once formed are permanent for life, indelible. And that the best one could do was to set up competing preferred learnings that hopefully would override an existing problematic learning. That seemed the best you could do, and many therapies are based on that. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy is explicitly based on that. Exposure therapy.
It's sort of, that thing of the grass, the field of grass, and if you keep walking down one pathway, you get a solid pathway down it, but then if you start walking somewhere else, that other old one grows over. But what we found was that old one doesn't actually grow over completely. It doesn't actually completely
Emotional learnings, in other words, any learning formed in the presence of strong emotion, forms a special kind of synapse in the memory circuits that are formed that lock very strongly. The neurons that are joined together are locked together permanently for life unless, now we know, unless this very special sequence of experiences occurs that unlocks them. That's what reconsolidation is. Reconsolidation allows new learning to erase a target learning, an existing problematic learning. Of course, the brain is so plastic that any new learning changes the brain, as we hear about so much in the therapy field now. It's true, of course. Any new learning changes the brain. But transformational change occurs when new learning dissolves an old learning that's problematic. Otherwise, new learning sets up separately and competes against the old learning and doesn't compete well, because the learnings we're talking about are problematic learnings that are emotionally very charged and urgent. And as a rule, they are much stronger than the preferred new learnings that we set up in therapy, and relapses occur when the competing type of setup is in place. Reconsolidation allows us to knowingly and deliberately and controllably and consistently now, that's the whole point, use the brain's rules, follow the brain's requirements for unlocking those synapses and creating new learning in such a way that it directly, as some of the neuroscientists say, updates or rewrites or erases the target learning. That's transformational change. And that's what this is all about, putting that process in therapists' hands so that a new level of consistency of creating this deep, lasting change. You know, I think it's what we as therapists thrive on or most. We gain our greatest satisfaction from those sessions where a deep shift occurs that results in a falling away of long-term distressing symptoms in a permanent manner. And a person experiences an actual liberation from something that has had a vice grip for a long time. That sustains us as therapists. You know, we need more of that ourselves because this is hard work, right? So, you know, we three authors of this book have experienced this great increase of reliability and regularity of having those kinds of satisfaction of therapeutic breakthroughs. We've been teaching this now for almost 20 years, and we know it's teachable. We have plenty of therapists who are out there doing this. In fact, the part 2 of the book, as you've seen, is contributed case studies, somewhat longer studies than the examples in part 1 of the book, from therapists who've learned this from us and are doing it, and you can see how well they're doing it. Beautiful, beautiful work. So to us, it's a very exciting time in the field.
And I think there's a few things because I'm kind of hoping that people listening are not so much confused, but a little sort of going, oh, I'm not quite sure what they're talking about, because what we're doing is challenging a lot of historic understanding and a lot of historic feelings about stuff. I mean, 1 or 2 comments I just want to make before I'd like to ask you to give us a bit of an example, because I think that might help. Examples always help. But as you know, I'm doing another course. I don't know. I started late in life, so I'm learning as I go. But I got accepted into Sydney University here, which is in the medical department, and we're in the brain and mind sciences stuff area we're talking. But we talk mostly about rats and various things. And so we were talking about this this concept of reconsolidation a while ago, before I got a chance to look at your book. So I was sort of aware of what we were doing, what you were talking about. And one girl put up her hand in the class and said, you know, what are we doing? Are we erasing people's memories? You know, this is really bad. You know, we don't have the right to take people's memories. But that's not what it is. It's so hard for us to understand the different layers of approach. Our autobiography stays the same, but what we're talking about is the associations that we make with events. And that's what the brain does. It associates things. And it will associate a fearful concern with a fearful concerning event as a self-protective measure for the future. So it's a very healthy thing to do, but it just can really muck you around.
I think as we get into perhaps an example, as you're suggesting, it might help illuminate those points in a way that makes it real and clearer. Because
we've given them a context.
The abstract remains a bit puzzling or blurry intrinsically. So, well, should I try to do that? Should I launch into an example?
Can you do that? No, I think we've given them enough theoretical background for them to go autobiographical memory, reconsolidated, extinction, memories coming, memories going. Please God help.
Really? Yes. This is difficult, challenging work, and it is humbling. All right. Let's see. I think a good example would be, okay, the fellow. There's a few good ones for this purpose to choose from, but I think I will go with the fellow that we call Jason for the purpose of this example. He was in his 50s when he came to see me, and his problem was that despite his own intentions for quite a long time now, to the contrary, he has been changing jobs and careers every couple of years for his entire adult life.
Wow.
And at this point in his life, in his mid-50s, he is getting pretty upset about how this has prevented him from really mastering any one area, because he's never, gotten really good at anything, as well as capping his income at a fairly low entry level in every field. So it's had quite real material effects on his life and lifestyle. And it keeps happening, despite, him having noticed the pattern and wanting to change it, keeps happening. And he sort of almost getting desperate about pulling out of this pattern before it's too late. So now, I do coherence therapy. That's what I do. So this example will be an example of coherence therapy, but we'll use it, as I mentioned, as a demonstration platform to make broader points about emotional memory and emotional learning and the therapeutic reconsolidation process. As soon as I received from Jason that description of the symptom, and that is step one, acquiring from the client a clear enough, specific enough description of the problem or symptom as experienced by the client, some experiential particulars. So his job changing every few years is the pattern that we need to get to here. And in coherence therapy, we immediately, having identified the symptom or problem pattern, immediately begin an experiential process of bringing to light, out of unawareness, out of the implicit knowledge library of the client, so to speak, what personal living knowledge, what compelling emotional learnings are actually making this job changing an emotional necessity, an adaptive, perhaps self-protective. We don't want to narrow down the possibilities too soon, but that's the kind of thing we're looking for. What emotional knowledge that he formed in experiences earlier in life makes this pattern that he truly suffers and wants to be rid of in some unrecognized way actually an emotional necessity. So here's how I did that with him. We have an array of different ways of going about that discovery work, that retrieval work that brings this material into awareness. I remember with him, sitting there and moments of choosing between two different avenues of doing this process. One was a straightforward approach. It's not even really what I think of as a technique. It's a direct empathic eliciting. I realized I could simply say to him something like, I wonder if you might already know something about experiences you've had in life where you learned very deeply that staying put in one job maybe isn't such a good idea. So, that was one, you can see how that would begin to bring his attention down into the right area without my interpreting what's there to find. You see, coherence therapy is very directive on a process level, but not directive at all, or leading on a content level. We guide the client to go to where the relevant material is, bump into it experientially, and articulate it, and as the therapist, we learn from the client what this material is made of. So that was one possible way to go. Another was one of our discovery techniques that we call symptom deprivation. I realized I could also guide him into an imaginal experience of staying in one job years. I could have, coached him or prompted him with descriptions of, it's been 2 years now, and we just had an annual review, and it's pretty good, and we just got a raise, and this looks like it could really hold longer term and be a good thing. And, you go home that evening and you tell a few friends about the good news. You let them know you're really in this. See what I mean? This isn't just cognitive work. This isn't just thinking about. This is really experiential engagement with the material. That symptom deprivation, in other words, having a real experience of being without the symptom. Well, if indeed a symptom is emotionally necessary, then what's that mean? It means being without the symptom is going to bring something unpleasant, unwelcome, uncomfortable. And that sure enough, that would have bumped him into it. But I chose the other path. I just did the straightforward. Is there something in your life that might have let you know that staying in one job is not a good idea? And sure enough, he, for a few seconds, he gazed into the middle distance and started to talk. And what was coming to mind spontaneously in response was very vivid memories from childhood, scenes of being a little boy, and the family lived in a small East Coast industrial town, one or two big companies, and most of the men in the town work at these companies, and assembly lines and all that kind of experience. And how Dad would come home pretty much every night miserable, just radiating misery and often bitterness, and often grumbling and venting how unhappy he is and what a dead-end situation it is for him, and just stuck in this hellish life with no way out, in this company forever. And for little Jason, how children, how vividly they feel the parents' emotional states.
Yeah, absolutely.
As he was telling me this, I started to ask him, well, how is this for you? Go ahead, be in the scene that's coming to mind so vividly. There you are, little you, hearing Dad again, saying these things, having these feelings that you feel so directly. How is that for you? And he started telling me how frightening, both painful and frightening, both at once, very intensely. And he lived in that pain and fear. How many years marinated in that experience. And as we unpacked that, and a moment came where I said to him something like, so there you are, there's little you, immersed in that. What is it you are learning there as a little boy about how you want your life to be or not to be? What are you learning? Inviting him to find words for that. Now, these are things that have never been explicitly conscious in his thinking, ever. See, that this is the process of bringing implicit knowledge into explicit knowing. And we focus that implicit to explicit process on the very material necessitating the specific presenting symptom. So as a result of that next piece of work, what we came to was a verbalization of the specific emotional learning. And this is the material. This is it. We're getting to it now. And what the exact wording that we came to capturing this for him, the emotional learning, what we call in coherence therapy, we call it the emotional truth of the symptom. But technically, it's the emotional learning specifics. And the words that captured it for him that he felt were exactly it. I've got to switch jobs because staying in one career brings the deadness and misery that killed Dad's spirit. Boy, that's really powerful stuff.
Yeah, that's touching.
At the time, the two of us getting to this and being in it together, it was pretty intense and very important. And there was another piece that brings the deadness and misery that killed Dad's spirit. I've got to keep that from happening to me. Okay? The simple words, ordinary language, but in very vivid personal terms, very emotional, no politeness, no pulling of the punches of what this is really made of. He felt that really fit. So let's stare at that for a moment, because we see a lot about how emotional memory works and a lot about how coherence therapy works too. I've got to switch jobs because staying in one career brings the deadness and misery that killed Dad's spirit. Well, that's that's what we call, not just in coherence therapy, but a number of different therapies that are on the front end of understanding how emotional learning works. Recognize that that's a mental model that he formed. That staying in one career brings the deadness and misery that kills God's spirit. He learned that as a truth about life, a generalized model of how the world works in that area. He did not know. That's implicit learning. That's forming models and schemas as implicit knowledge with no awareness of doing so. He doesn't experience that as a mental model he has. He experiences that as reality without even questioning. And it became clear to him at the point where this material was now in words and sitting there with mindful awareness now that he's been living according to this living knowledge that he formed. Now his job changing suddenly makes sense. It no longer seems like a shameful failure, which is how he was consciously making sense of it up until now. The inner emotional necessity was now fully apparent. It made sense of his life experience. And that's what we mean by coherence in our name, Coherence Therapy. Therapists are widely familiar across the therapy field with the need of the conscious mind and the conscious brain to form coherent narratives about our life experience. That's already very well understood and well recognized. What coherence therapy adds to the picture is that coherence is also the nature of the deeper emotional brain, emotional learnings that are so often regarded as irrational, maladaptive, dysfunctional, dysregulation. We don't see any of those pathological qualities when we go there into the emotional implicit learning areas with our clients. We see coherence. We see sophisticated learnings and sophisticated solutions to the problems initially modeled. Now, add to that coherence the recognition from neuroscience, which has established very firmly that the synapses of emotional learnings lock. The brain was shaped by natural selection, evolution, to form emotional learnings, these kinds of emotional learnings, such that they never fade out. They're supposed to last forever. They're supposed to re-trigger 35, 45 years later when the situation looks the same. That's not dysregulation or dysfunction. That's the emotional brain working as evolution shaped it to do. Apparently, it was survival positive to form emotional learning that really hold. But that also means that we're stuck. We're imprisoned in the emotional learnings we originally formed. And as I mentioned, up until 2000, it looked as if the brain did not have a key to the lock of those synapses. Well, reconsolidation research was a major breakthrough because it was the discovery of the key that the brain does have to unlock those synapses and free us from these emotional learnings, which otherwise would last a lifetime and maintain their intensely strong grip. So I guess that's the first stage of the example I'm sharing with you, the discovery, the retrieval. Then, the retrieval, we're actually not yet to the reconsolidation process in this example. Sometimes this seems to me similar to a good paint job where it can take 2 or 3 weeks to do all the prep work, and then the paint job takes 2 hours, Well, this process is very much the same. This retrieval work is usually the bulk of the work. Jason is, one of the more clean and clear cases where in 2 sessions we were at this point where we have the material in hand very clearly and now can move into the reconsolidation work. But with many clients, it's more complex. The material may be intensely traumatic material where it's very necessary to go in what we call small enough steps so that the work is tolerable, the retrieval is tolerable, special trauma techniques may be needed. There may be, sometimes there are more than one emotional learning maintaining a given symptom. And this whole process needs to be done more than one mental model or schema. So, I don't want to make it seem too simplified or like a miracle cure. Often there's significant complexity or resistances can develop too. All of which.
Just want to add one.
Yeah.
Just want to add one in there, Bruce, which I think is interesting in the context of brain plasticity, because I've just had a couple of clients, one in particular, that also presented to me a situation. I mean, the term I use with clients, which they rather like of this thing, is an untrue truth. And you argue this untrue truth. And what the brain will also do is it'll get ideas, it'll get associations, but in some clients, the brain will actually not develop in certain areas. It will not form the developments and the relationships, particularly in the sense of appreciating other people's emotions, that temporal parietal junction area there of figuring out how other people think, because it's not safe to think what other people are thinking because they hurt. So that's just another reason why it can take some time. Sometimes you actually have to rebuild their brain to a point where they can actually start, which is interesting as well.
The approach we take to that particular dynamic or situation in coherence therapy is somewhat the other way around. If we see that a person is lacking certain functionalities or learnings or knowings, we immediately assume that that lack is emotionally necessary, as you just, I think, suggested, actually, as part of what you just said. And rather than try to build up that capacity or resource, we don't do that. Because if indeed the lack of it is emotionally necessary, in some way that's not yet recognized or explicit, to try to build up is to unwittingly fight that part of the person that knows I better not do that. So what we do is we do coherence therapy on what's apparently lacking without ever talking about it as a lack or a deficit or an untrue anything. And in a similar way, as I've described with Jason, bring the person into their own emotional truth of how and why they know never to understand somebody else's emotion. For example, using the example you gave, never go there. And to unpack and bring out what they know to expect would happen if they did, right? That they learned in certain ways back when. So it's, again, the coherence therapy pattern applied to whatever pattern is arising that's problematic. So let's see, where are we? Should I continue forward and describe how then the therapeutic reconsolidation process unfolded with Jason?
Yeah, I think everybody's on the edge of their seat. This is fantastic.
Good. All right. See, I'll fortify myself first here.
Oh, that's yes. You're doing a lot. You're doing all the talking. It's great.
Excuse me. All right. Okay. At the point where we now have explicit knowledge of the symptom necessitating material, the coherent emotional truth of the symptom, you can see it's made up of very well-defined knowings. And the model of the world that it's made of is very specific, and that always turns out to be the case. These things seem blurry and mysterious from the start going in on it, but once the retrieval work is adequately carried out, these emotional learnings are very well defined. The therapeutic reconsolidation process, the part of the coherence therapy methodology that matches point for point what the neuroscience research found, starts here. Reconsolidation occurs. In other words, the synapses are unlocked when the following sequence of experiences occurs. First, the target memory or emotional learning needs to be reactivated. And that means what therapists all, at least intuitively, know it means. Some cue, some trigger, some piece of the original perceptual setup needs to be presented such that that particular mental model or schema or emotional learning activates, swings into action, okay? Creates an emotional state as well as a tendency to perhaps certain behavior, or certain moods or thoughts. Reactivation. The neuroscientists call this reminding. Therapists tend to think more in terms of reactivation, retriggering. That's the first experience that the brain requires to launch reconsolidation and unlock the synapses. But the reconsolidation research has now shown decisively, with many replications, that reactivation alone does not actually launch reconsolidation. And as an aside, I'll mention that there's actually some confusion about that still, even among the researchers. You'll see some, especially in journalism articles about reconsolidation, or almost without exception, still so far, the science journalists talk about reconsolidation as if reactivation alone triggers reconsolidation and unlocks synapses. Nope, there's a second distinct experience that's necessary in order for the unlocking to happen. And that is an experience, while the target learning is reactivated, an experience of what the neuroscientists call a mismatch. Something that is at odds with what the target learning expects to happen, or expects about how the world works. That mismatch can be either a novelty that wasn't at all part of the original learning, or it can be an outright contradiction of what the target learning expects. You see both types of mismatch in the reconsolidation research, which is very simplified. You know, in order to do controlled experiments that are decisive, the neuroscientists do very simplified arrangements and protocols and setups. In therapy, we have to deal with quite the opposite end of the spectrum, very complex, challenging material and situations. And what we find in our almost 20 years now of experience with coherence therapy with this process is that we look for an experience that's an outright contradiction of the target material. And we call that contradictory knowledge. So the search for contradictory knowledge to use to create this mismatch experience, this side-by-side experience of the reactivated target learning and a living experience of something else that, wait a minute, both cannot possibly be true. That's the nature of the mismatch experience. Within coherence therapy, we call that a juxtaposition experience, side by side. Well, it's at the point where you've retrieved the target learning, the symptom requiring material, very explicitly, like we arrived at with Jason, that you can begin the search for a contradictory knowledge. So that's the next step. In coherence therapy, as soon as you've got what we sometimes call the pro-symptom schema, the symptom requiring schema or mental model, now we begin to look for contradictory knowledge that's accessible to the client, that can be experienced as real by the client, not just positive thinking or cognitive insights. This has to be experientially very real, very vivid, just as vivid as the target learning is, in order for the juxtaposition experience to be adequate. So I began that with Jason, and there's a wide range of methods and techniques for finding contradictory knowledge at this point. In fact, there's no let up here. We just finished working on this book, and now we want to complete a manual, a coherence therapy manual, entirely about this step of finding contradictory knowledge by the end of the year. So wish me luck, okay?
Oh, yeah, great. Please do. Yeah.
Yeah. Have another sip.
Yeah.
Well, the way I did it with Jason was this. I first asked myself, you know, often the technique for this that's simplest and is available for maybe half of clients is to look for whether they already are in possession of the contradictory knowledge that's needed. It happens about half the time, maybe a little more. And I looked through my notes of my first 2 or 3 sessions with Jason, thought about everything he's told me, and sure enough, remembered something he mentioned in passing in the first session. that looked like a possibility to explore. He had mentioned to me that in his dilettantish, all over the place manner, he was currently also doing some volunteer work once a week in a school for learning challenged children, developmental disabilities. And he had mentioned that he finds that work very engaging, and really got it was an excellent experience for him to be among these teachers doing this work. Mentioned it in passing. I might not have ever thought about it again, except now I'm looking for contradictory knowledge to this very specific mental model or emotional learning that, because I now know the details of it, it sort of tunes me to know how to scan for something that might be contradictory of that. And I'm looking for something that would contradict staying in one career will always bring the deadness and misery that killed Dad's spirit. That generalized learning of that. I'm looking for something. And I realize, wow, he perceives the teachers at this school in a very different way than that. His comment in the first session gave me that impression, right? That he sees aliveness and engagement in these people who are career teachers in this context. So I said to him, very soon after this wording was finalized for the target learning, the symptom acquiring knowledge, he said, you know, there's something I want to check on with you that you mentioned to me in the first session. You told me about working with these teachers, how much you enjoyed it, and I want to hear a little more about what you see in that is so appealing and attractive and makes you keep going back week after week in this volunteer work. And he rolled into it. He went right into it. Oh, they find their work so meaningful. They're so good at what they do, and they know they are, and they love using their knowledge to help these children, and they do help these children. And I see it, and I see how much it means to them to help these children. And it's hard work. They go home tired, but I can see that this is terrific for them. And I said, you know, he's describing this to me, and I can see he doesn't realize he has contradictory knowledge, because the brain's separate memory systems hold these things in completely separate compartments. And these juxtaposition experiences won't happen by themselves, even though all the needed material is right there. So with his description of these teachers, I felt we've got it. This looks like really vivid living knowledge that's directly contradictory. So at that moment, I shifted into this sequence of experiences that the neuroscience research has chalked out. I used empathy. This is normally how we do it in coherence therapy, using just direct empathy to set it up, and you'll see just what I mean. So Jason, tell me if I'm understanding correctly what I've learned from you. One part of you is so clear that staying in one career on and on and on will necessarily, definitely bring any person or any man into the kind of deadness and misery that you saw so closely in your father. And that's so real to you. And at the same time, and now you see I've reactivated the target knowledge with that. My empathic tone is bringing him back into a re-experience of it, not just thinking about it, re-cueing it. And then I segue very naturally into, and at the same time, you have such close-up knowledge of these teachers in the special education school and how enriched they feel in their work, which they stay in year after year after year. They're so committed to this work. Long-term careers in which they're fed by the meaningfulness and contribution that they see they can make. And he's nodding, you know, yeah, that's real. I'm with you. And I actually do use my hands in this way sometimes with clients to actually sort of physically cue the both at once juxtaposition. And so there I've got it. There I've got the first instance of the both at once juxtaposition of the reactivated living target knowledge, the contradictory knowledge experienced as real in the presence of the target knowledge. And so that's it. That actually, according to the neuroscience research, the synapses of his emotional learning should be unlocking as of right then and available to be rewritten by the new knowledge. What we do in coherence therapy for step 3 of the process, which is a few repeated doses of the new knowledge to rewrite the target knowledge, is we simply repeat the juxtaposition experience and empathetically several times, 2, 3, 4 times if possible. So number 1 is done. That's the mismatch that should be unlocking the synapses. And now I roll into a few repetitions of the same juxtaposition. So how is that for you right now? To be sitting there, feeling the realness to you of both of these. The part of you that knows for sure that staying in one career forever will definitely bring deadness and a kind of emotional death. And this other experience that's so real to you, that's so different. Where these people stay on, and it's wonderful. How is that? Mm. And he's looking at me, and he's in this curious moment. We call it, in coherence therapy, we call it experiential dissonance. Yeah, yeah. A kind of experiential and rich version of cognitive dissonance. He kind of, blinks and sits there in it, and then says, well, if things I've believed all my life aren't real, and you can see from how he's saying it that the unrealness is suddenly becoming apparent. And that's exactly it. There's the unlearning beginning. Right in those moments. As you saw in chapter 4 of our book, chapter 4 is all about the actual moments of profound change. Yes. This process allows the therapist to actually see the moments when it's happening. It's a wonderful experience for the therapist. So I can see that the unrealness of his constructs are becoming apparent to him. These are the moments when implicit emotional constructs that felt like reality, by virtue of being disconfirmed, are becoming apparent as only his constructs to him. And he says to me, well, if what I've been believing all my life isn't real, that's kind of upsetting. Yeah. And he meant it. Yeah. Now, sometimes at the moments where the material that's had the problematic, distressing grip for so long starts to release, some clients go into joy. And we see sometimes a kind of free energy laughter that's just delightful. But it is equally a marker that the process is happening when the client starts to go into grieving or a kind of disorientation. And so I saw that a grieving process, a painful loss. And indeed, as we went further with that, he was going into the grieving that sometimes develops, where it's distressing to see that he lived so much of his life according to a false notion. And by the way, he never heard me say false. In coherence therapy, we never, invalidate the client's learnings. We do it in the way I just described. The client arrives at recognizing, oh, this isn't the truth of life or how life works. Well, of course, sometimes recognizing that you've been living in a certain way according to certain assumptions about the world was completely untrue and cost you dearly, that's painful. So I then had to work with him in a grief process. That with him it took 2.5 sessions. Could have taken longer. He moved through it fairly well. I accompanied him and empathized with him on the distress of it. And as he could process the grieving, he could allow the full disconfirmation of the original learning to occur, the full dissolution to occur. And just to try to wrap up the case example,
Yeah.
Sooner rather than later, I'll just drop to the bottom line and say that he reported to me in the 5th session. We do a verification step in coherence therapy. We want to know whether or not the target material really has been dissolved. We don't want to assume it has. So we deliberately try to guide the client back into a retriggering of it. And I did that. He came in and said a few things about how it doesn't feel the same anymore, and he now wants to apply to be a special education teacher, and he feels like he could really see that as a career. And I said, well, that sounds great. It sounds like the shift you've been looking for, but come on, tell me, what about this other part of you? Let's check in with the part of you that knows that if you really install yourself in a career like that, it knows what's going to happen. You'll wind up as unhappy as your father. What about that? Making it clear that I welcome hearing about the part that really still feels it's true. And, he's feeling around for that inside, and he comes up empty-handed and says, I don't feel any of that now. It feels like it's okay. It's okay to have a career. And that helped. I did follow up with him some months later, and that helped. So it seemed as if the original, the target learning that had been so strong for so many decades of his life had dissolved. So now, what shall we talk about in terms of what that example showed us? We've seen the coherence. We've seen the empathizing for both sides. This is it's a completely non-counteractive process, as I mentioned briefly earlier. We never talk about the target learning or the original learnings as irrational or incorrect in any way. Those are emotional truths. We're very respectful of those original learnings. They were very true of life back then. And knowing that the emotional brain sets up these learnings to last forever, we don't see it as a dysfunction that they still felt true up until the reconsolidation work finally dissolved. So that, in a nutshell, well, I guess that's a pretty big nutshell, but we're trying to put that process in the hands of as many therapists as possible, whether they do it through coherence therapy or any one of a number of different therapies. You saw in chapter 1 of our manuscript that we've listed about, 15 or 20 different therapies that we see as particularly congenial to guiding the therapeutic reconsolidation process if only the therapist knows to do so while using that particular therapy. So it's a very accessible process for many different orientations.
And I think that's actually the key, if I can just jump in on there, that in explaining to the therapist what it is. Because, as we've been talking and as I thought about it before this, there's lots of experiences that we feel, lots of things we see in the therapy rooms, lots we see in other therapies do, where there seems to be a sudden, complete shift in the client. Sometimes I think this is what we call experiences of insight. Not every experience of insight, but sometimes we have this thing as insight, and it's exactly that. People are steeped in their difficult, uncomfortable experience. Something comes along which basically, as you say, contradicts the story. Suddenly their brain goes click, and from that moment of what we're calling insight, that previous situation completely disappears. I think some of the work they do on phobias, where they do things like, go through the phobia and get into it from a distance, then reverse it and go through it backwards, again a contradictory type of aspect.
This process does happen all over the place. We want therapists to understand the process so clearly that they can make it happen or guide it to happen.
Yeah.
Very reliably, rather than relying on luck and intuition and a less clear understanding of what the essential ingredients of the process are. Those steps that I described are actually what are called specific factors, as distinct from the non-specific common factors. And I think a therapist who's very clear about what those steps are, those specific factors, those specific emotional and inner processes are, can enjoy a great increase in consistency in bringing about those kinds of shifts you were just describing. You're absolutely right. One of the significant pieces of the picture that's developed from the neuroscience is that the reconsolidation process, the unlocking process of the synapses on that cellular and molecular level, that type of neuroplasticity is actually, according to current neuroscience, that's the only mechanism in the brain that can unlock these synapses. There's no other mechanism on the cellular level and no other behavioral sequence of experiences on the subjective level that I described can unlock the synapses, according to current neuroscience. That's not theoretical. That's the empirical state of the field. So whenever we see the kind of profound change you were just describing, where a long-standing emotional reaction that's been pretty intense stops and doesn't return, and symptoms of mood, behavioral thought that were being produced by that emotional reaction or schema also cease happening and don't return. And the absence of the symptom and the emotional reaction are effortless as of then. No counteractive work or maintenance work is needed because the underlying emotional learning that was driving the symptom literally no longer exists.
And
those, well, what I just mentioned are the markers. Those are the observable markers of this transformational change that, as far as we now know, only reconsolidation can bring about. So when we see that kind of change, when we see those markers, it's legitimate at this point to infer that this process occurred, whether or not it was noticed, in the moment, in the sessions. In other words, that the reconsolidation process, in fact, occurred. And in fact, that logic that I just chalked out, that it has to be reconsolidation if you see the markers of that kind of change, has been showing up in the field more and more. I piped up about that back in 2006, and then we've had, let's see, since then, in 2008, Francine Shapiro published the same logic, making the point that reconsolidation appears to be the underlying mechanism for the change they see in the changes, the transformations that are seen in doing EMDR. And then in 2010, Leslie Greenberg, one of the co-founders of emotion-focused therapy, published an article in which, similarly, he ascribed the transformational changes they see in EFT to the reconsolidation mechanism. Again, according to the same logic that when you see that kind of change, it has to be reconsolidation to our best neuroscientific knowledge.
No, I think what's interesting here, Bruce, is that going back earlier on, something you said which is quite true in the sense that we develop these emotional memories and emotional associations in order to protect ourselves, and what we thought was they were lifelong. But it was an evolutionarily necessary development. It was a survival benefit. But the reconsolidation is also a very complex and biologically integrated activity, biochemical activity. I mean, we have protein synthesis. So this too.
Yeah, it's intrinsic to.
And so this too was an evolutionary beneficial aspect, I think we can suggest, is that certainly laying down emotional concerns and fears and preparations for the future was important, but it was also important for survival that when things changed, that we changed into a new frame. So
Isn't that fascinating? Yeah. That, well, I think all of us who are interested in the brain and fascinated by it have read all over the place that the brain's complexity is so vast, and the brain's redundancy. It has so many ways of doing the functions that it needs to do. And that's a big aspect of the neuroplasticity, is that when one avenue of accomplishing one of its functions is blocked, it has other ways to do that. And here we see a similar kind of marvelous range of functions and mechanisms in the brain. Evolution formed a brain that has these two very different ways of using new learning for adaptive needs. It can use new learning while preserving the old learning, right? And that's what we see in extinction, the creation of a new learning that can prevail, but the old learning is still there, and it can then re-prevail. And at the same time, there's this reconsolidation mechanism where new learning can actually erase and eliminate the old learning. And the interface between those two mechanisms is actually a specific area of the research. And it's very complex. And actually, both processes can be triggered simultaneously. There are studies, boy, they're ingenious the way they design these studies because it's complex stuff, as you said. And you can have situations where only extinction happens, where the new learning is only counteracting the existing one. You can have situations where only reconsolidation happens, where the new learning sort of eliminates the old learning. You can have situations where both happen. They call this boundary conditions, these specific conditions that determine which it will be and which prevails.
Yeah, I know, I'm familiar with that stuff. I mean, if you want to really learn about all this stuff and you want to really experience it, then become a lab rat. Unfortunately,
you'll experience it.
Yeah, we can do it. We can do it. Oh, look, that must be the bell telling us that we've got to stop. That's my phone. Can you believe it? And it's too far over there for me to someone will hang up. So I guess we will have to take that as our cue to go. I mean, everybody back out there, we've had this long conversation of just such depth and intricate description. You know, we spent a little bit of time on the technical details, but that description of working with Jason, and I'm just going to watch this over and over and over again because it was just a great description, Bruce. It was a very careful and very well laid out, and I think a lot of people will see the potential. Hopefully they see there's a lot to learn. This isn't just a 1, 2, 3, 4, do the steps, wham, bam, everybody's better. There's
right.
We've got to get into this and study this, and your place is a great place to start. As we're saying, go to the website and link in, you know, to Bruce's website and get in contact. Get this book, you know. This will be, you know, go into, where are we? It's all, everything's backwards. Get into Amazon, Unlocking the Emotional Brain. We'll have to knock off because just simply time. I mean, we've only just begun. We've only just scratched the surface, but you've scratched it really nicely and given us an insight into it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, goodbye everybody, and you know, we'll see you next time. We'll see what fascinating person emerges to chat with us next time. And Bruce, I just can't thank you enough. So with that, I'll just say thank you. So, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.